From Beijing today, the sharp clash between China and the United States over the war in Ukraine has once again moved into the spotlight. On September 5th, 2025, Chinese officials responded directly and forcefully to remarks made by U.S. President Donald Trump, who had called on European allies to impose economic pressure on Beijing as a way of shaping the conflict in Ukraine. Standing at the podium of the Foreign Ministry in Beijing, spokesman Guo Jiakun left little doubt about China's rejection of Washington's approach. In carefully measured yet unmistakably firm words, he underlined Beijing's position. Guo Jiakun said, "We firmly oppose the practice of constantly dragging China into the matter of the war, and we strongly oppose the imposition of so-called economic pressure on China." The statement was short but carried wide implications. For months, Western leaders have debated how to increase the cost of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. President Trump, in particular, has raised the idea that China should be treated as a critical partner to Moscow. Pressuring Beijing, he argued, would indirectly weaken Russia's ability to sustain its war machine. But for China, this narrative is unacceptable. Officials in Beijing insist they are not directly involved in the conflict, even as Western intelligence points to growing trade flows between Russia and China that have cushioned Moscow against Western sanctions. By responding so directly to Trump's remarks, China signaled it would not allow itself to be cast as a secondary aggressor in a war it describes as not of its making. The controversy began just days earlier when President Trump addressed European leaders during a joint press appearance. He urged them to adopt tougher measures against Beijing, suggesting that without Chinese trade and financial networks, Russia would find it far more difficult to sustain its war effort. Trump's blunt words echoed a line he has often repeated during his political career, that Europe must shoulder more responsibility and that major powers like China cannot be allowed to benefit from what he sees as loopholes in global sanctions. Although Trump did not outline specific measures, his message was unmistakable. He wants Europe to consider cutting economic ties with China in ways that would increase pressure on both Beijing and Moscow simultaneously. In Beijing, the Foreign Ministry's daily press briefing became the venue for a direct rebuttal. Guo Jiakun, appearing calm but emphatic, warned against what he described as the dangerous habit of blaming China for a war it did not start. Guo Jiakun said, "We firmly oppose the practice of constantly dragging China into the matter of the war, and we strongly oppose the imposition of so-called economic pressure on China." This was not simply routine diplomatic language. By repeating the word oppose twice in a single sentence, Beijing underscored its determination to resist any attempt at economic coercion. In the past, China has framed sanctions as illegitimate tools of power politics, instruments that violate international norms of fair trade. Today's statement followed that same logic, but was more explicit in rejecting Trump's framing. China's role in the Ukraine conflict has been one of the most contested subjects since the war began in February 2022. While Beijing has never provided direct military support to Russia, it has become one of Moscow's key lifelines. Trade between the two countries has surged, particularly in energy and raw materials. Russian oil and gas exports to China have climbed sharply, giving Moscow critical revenue at a time when European markets have closed. At the same time, Beijing has positioned itself diplomatically as a self-proclaimed neutral actor. Chinese officials argue they want peace and have even floated proposals for negotiations. But Western leaders remain deeply skeptical, pointing to Beijing's refusal to condemn Russia's invasion and its increasing economic entanglement with Moscow. Trump's comments, therefore, fit into a wider narrative of Western frustration. Washington and Brussels see Beijing as undermining sanctions by providing Moscow with alternative markets and access to technology. For China, however, these accusations are both politically charged and strategically dangerous, especially at a time when its economy is already under pressure from slowing growth and rising tensions with the United States. Analysts in Beijing note that the timing of Trump's remarks is significant. The U.S. president has been building a case for broader international unity against Russia, pressing Europe to do more and framing China as a silent enabler of the war. By rejecting this narrative so firmly, Beijing is protecting two crucial interests, its economic stability and its diplomatic standing. First, Chinese leaders cannot afford to appear weak in the face of U.S. demands. At home, national pride and sovereignty are central to the Communist Party's legitimacy. Any suggestion that China is being bullied into compliance risks domestic backlash. Second, Beijing is deeply invested in its partnership with Moscow. While not a formal alliance, the relationship has strategic importance for both sides. For Russia, China is a crucial market and a diplomatic shield. For China, Russia is a counterweight to Western influence and a source of discounted energy supplies. This explains why Beijing framed Trump's remarks as an attempt to drag China into the matter. The language suggests not just annoyance, but a recognition that Washington wants to make China a central target of its Ukraine strategy. Trump's call to Europe also puts European capitals in a difficult position. On the one hand, many EU leaders agree that China's support for Russia undermines sanctions. On the other hand, Europe remains heavily dependent on China for trade, investment, and critical supply chains. Calls for economic pressure on Beijing run directly into the reality of Europe's reliance on Chinese markets. Some European officials have already voiced caution, noting that sanctions on China would have wide-reaching consequences for their own economies. At the same time, pressure from Washington, particularly from a U.S. president who has repeatedly clashed with Europe on trade, creates political tension inside the transatlantic alliance. The exchange highlights how the Ukraine war has become more than just a regional conflict. It has become a diplomatic flashpoint between major powers. Trump's remarks and Beijing's reaction illustrate the deep mistrust between Washington and Beijing, as well as the difficulty of building a truly global consensus on Ukraine. For China, today's statement is about drawing a red line. By publicly rejecting Trump's call, Beijing is signaling that it will not accept being portrayed as complicit in Russia's war. For Washington, the goal remains to keep China under pressure, ensuring that Russia's lifelines are as narrow as possible. The question now is whether this clash will escalate further. If European leaders heed Trump's call, Beijing could find itself facing new restrictions on trade, technology, or finance. That would almost certainly provoke retaliation, deepening the rift between China and the West. If Europe resists, however, Trump may use the issue to criticize European allies for being soft on both Russia and China. For Ukraine, the stakes are equally high. The war has entered a grinding phase, and Western leaders are searching for new ways to shift the balance. Whether targeting China will succeed or whether it will instead trigger new geopolitical confrontations remains uncertain. From the podium in Beijing, Guo Jiakun's words summed up the Chinese government's stance with clarity and force. Guo Jiakun said, "We firmly oppose the practice of constantly dragging China into the matter of the war, and we strongly oppose the imposition of so-called economic pressure on China." That single sentence encapsulated the Chinese position: firm resistance to U.S. demands, rejection of being blamed for a war it insists it did not start, and a refusal to accept economic pressure as a legitimate tool of diplomacy. For Washington, the statement will be seen as proof that Beijing intends to shield Moscow. For Beijing, it is about defending sovereignty and rejecting what it sees as Western overreach. Either way, the clash between China and the United States over Ukraine has taken another sharp turn, one that will echo across global capitals in the weeks to come.